Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming today. My name's Jack Ashby from the Grant Museum of Zoology, and I'm here to welcome you and to welcome our speaker, who I am very excited to welcome, Professor Georgina Mace, who is Director for the Centre for Biodiversity and Environment Research here at UCL, where she is Professor of Biodiversity and Ecosystems. Georgina is one of the world's most influential ecologists. It's very exciting to have her here. She was instrumental in developing the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's categories for how species are categorized as how rare they are. So things like endangered, critically endangered, things that are used on a daily basis thousands of times a day across the world. That was Georgina's work. She is a Fellow of the Royal Society. She has an OBE and a CBE for Services to Environmental Biology. Former Zoological Director of Zoological Society of London, President of the Society for Conservation of Biology, former President of the British Ecological Society. I could go on. But her research is around trends and consequences of biodiversity loss and ecosystem changes. So she is perfectly placed to give today's talk. If you join me in welcoming Professor Georgina Mace.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for coming along on a cold, dark, rainy day. So what I'm going to do in this talk is discuss some of the history of nature conservation, how views of nature conservation have changed over time, but particularly with regard to this rather important question of how we account for that change and why it matters. And of course, you have to measure and record change in order to be able to respond to it. So I'm going to do that sort of the first half, and then in the second half, I'm going to move on to something a bit more radical and novel, which is thinking about accounting using a natural capital framework, which is something that I'm working on at the moment. But just to put this in context, the world that we live in at the moment is a world that is changing very rapidly. So these histograms on the left show you trends in society and the economy over the period since 1750 to about 2010. And you can see this rapid acceleration in a whole series of things that takes place after about 1950. So the one in the top left is population size, and you can see that ramping up very quickly after 1950. But you can see a whole series of other things: GDP, direct foreign investment, fertilizer use, paper production, dams, water use. All these are things that are happening to the environment that are brought about by growth in the number of people and in the scale of economies. And then the ones on the right, the blue graphs, are the same thing, but measuring a series of changes in the Earth system over that period of time. You can see the top left one is CO2 in the atmosphere. That's one of the causes of climate change, but a whole load of other things. And this period since 1950 to around 2000 is what some people call the Great Acceleration. It's a period of time when changes on the Earth are more rapid, more intense than they ever have been in human history. And they show no sign of abating. There's a few of them that are leveling off, but there's just as many that are increasing. And one of the things that's interesting to think about here is people worry about population, but actually many of these trends are more extreme. The ramping up is more steep than population is. So population's only a part of the problem. It's the number of people times what those people are doing. And if what people are doing is increasing faster than population, then that's a major driving force. So that's the kind of consumption and energy use and so on. Now, against that background, we have this problem that is well known and well understood, that biodiversity loss is continuing. At every scale that we look at, we're losing biodiversity. And that was most recently summarized in this figure last year that was prepared for a meeting of the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. The top line shows you pressures on biodiversity increasing. So this is things like extraction and land use change. The yellow curve, the second one down, is some measures of the state of biodiversity, how much biodiversity is left. That's going down rather relentlessly. The third line down is the benefits that people get from biodiversity. That's going down. And the one at the bottom is investment in biodiversity, what we're doing to try and reverse that trend, and that's going up. So we have a real problem here, that biodiversity continues to deteriorate, the benefits from it continue to deteriorate, despite the fact that we're investing more in it. And despite the fact that we're investing more in it, the pressures continue to increase. So there's something wrong with how we're trying to address this problem of the loss of biodiversity. And that's what I want to look at, how are we getting this wrong, and ways that we might think about it a bit differently. And I'm going to do that by a quick history of nature conservation, looking at these, the past phases, asking about who or what it was for, what the major activities were, and what its measures of success were. And it's quite interesting this, that although everybody believes they support biodiversity conservation, actually the thing that everybody agrees on is what they're against. They're against the loss of biodiversity and the extinction of species. But exactly what conservation is for, what the positive thing that we're trying to achieve, is much less clear. And it's gone through a series of phases. So if we go back to the early days of nature conservation, the 1960s and before that, is what I've called here nature for itself. This was nature conservation, mainly of species, mostly in protected areas, and this word cloud just tries to just summarize the ideas of the time. So it was about wilderness, protected areas, nature without people in it. This doesn't have people in it. These are sites and places that are protected where nature does its own thing, irrespective of people. And that approach to nature conservation continues today, but it tended to be accompanied by these, photos of beautiful, remote places. And that was what we did for many decades. But sometime around the 1980s, it became clear that these beautiful, remote places were no longer so beautiful and remote. There were huge pressures on them from people hunting, habitat change, destruction of rainforests, destruction of woodlands all over the world. And we moved into a phase in the sort of 1980s and 1990s, and this is when I trained as a conservationist, actually, that was sort of nature despite people. So again, this is about species, primarily about species and the conservation of species, trying to prohibit extinctions, but now we're focusing on these threats. The loss of habitat, invasive species, pollutions, pathogens, all these words about threats and drivers of change and so on. And you have these images of sort of ravaged landscapes and the hauls from overhunting and various kinds of depredation of wildlife that accompany this era. So it was very much focused on reversing the threats, and it didn't really help very much. And then when you get to about the year 2000, we move into a different phase where people realize that actually we rely on nature. Nature is necessary to support things that people do. And I'm calling this nature for people. So this is when we're going to preserve it because it supports ecosystem benefits and services on which people rely. Now you can see species suddenly disappears and gets replaced by ecosystems. We're now conserving these interacting bodies of species and the abiotic environment. And that's because it provides services for people, natural benefits. A lot of it's around water regulation, clean water, flood control, hazard regulation. We're thinking about stewardship and management. There's a lot of emphasis in this framing on human landscapes. People are now very much in the picture. Pollinators are a kind of poster child for this era of conservation. And lots of complicated frameworks to think about these benefits that people get from nature. And this, again, still persists to today. I work on this area quite a lot. It's kind of, it became a bit too utilitarian. A lot of conservationists became very uncomfortable with it because it felt like we were only interested in nature for what it could do to us. And I think in the last few years, we've moved into a fourth phase that I'm calling people and nature. And I put people first deliberately because it is still very anthropocentric, but it is about this dynamic interconnection of people and nature. It's what, how we rely on nature for people's well-being, but nature relies on us as well. It's no longer a kind of nature should provide us with these benefits. Now this one, I think people are definitely in the picture here. People and nature are interconnected. It's very much more about resilience, adaptability. It's no longer about preserving species and places remote from people. It's now about trying to maintain this dynamic system that supports a changing world, a world that's dominated by people, as I showed you from the Great Acceleration, where there are increasing demands and increasing pressures on all kinds of wildlife. But here there is a much more rosy view of these human-dominated landscapes, with people closely involved in nature in a whole variety of ways. And I think this is, I hope that this is a more stable framing. Interestingly, I don't think it's so different from the one I started with, nature for itself. It's just that it's put much more in the context of having people as part of nature rather than people apart from nature, as that one tended to do. So you see these four framings that have happened through time: nature for itself, nature despite people, nature for people, and now people and nature. And the interesting thing about it is that although those have emerged over time, and I put a very rough timeline on here from sort of 1960 to 2010, none of them have actually disappeared. We still have groups of people who support the nature for itself view, the nature despite people, the nature for people, and the people and nature. So when you get down here to the present day, you see all these four framings all in place. And I think this is part of the problem, part of the reason why we found it hard to articulate our vision for nature is we're talking about some very different things, and we're trying to accommodate some very different things within a single framing. And the really important thing at the moment is we live on a very crowded planet. People, even if we were able to reduce consumption quite substantially, we still probably will use more than 50% of all the net primary productivity that's produced on the Earth. So we're crowding out lots of these natural systems. And we need to find a way to make this balance between nature and people and nature actually work in this rapidly changing world. So I think there's no doubt that nature underpins all human activity. We know that we depend on it. We need clean air, clean water. We need natural products. We rely on the natural protection of many systems for hazards and floods, as well as really many people holding beautiful places and wild species in very high regard. So it underpins everything we do, but bizarrely, we don't really account for it. We don't record what we're doing with it. And maybe that's part of the problem of why it continues to degrade. We just continually running as fast as we can, but slipping back with nature conservation. So a lot of people have been concerned about that. And in fact, in a rather brave and bold government paper in 2011, this is a UK government white paper, a natural environment white paper, and it made the commitment that we would be the first generation to leave the natural environment in a better state than it inherited. This was actually a statement made at the end of the last Labour government. This white paper was theirs, but it was adopted by our current government. So it is a very important statement of intent. And I'm going to look at how that has been implemented over the last few years. The way that the government said they were going to do it was to create this Natural Capital Committee, an independent body to report to the government's Economic Affairs Committee chaired by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So this is reporting to the Chancellor. It's reporting to the Treasury. This body will put the value of nature at the heart of the government's economic thinking and advise government about the best way of securing our natural assets for the future. So that's great. And this is the Natural Capital Committee, and I'm a member of it. I'm up here. I was younger then. And it has on it some, so I'm an ecologist. It has another ecologist. It's chaired by Dieter Helm, who's an energy economist. It has 3 or so environmental economists and some people who think about accounting. It's been very interesting working with these people on trying to meet that government commitment. So, what is natural capital and how does it relate to what I've just talked about? So, because it's natural capital, because it's capital, it's part of the normal economic capitals framework. And when we think about capital, we normally think about what's called produced or manufactured capital. Buildings, finance, machines. These are things that we make, that people make, and what go into GDP accounts. The amount of production of those things is what we record as GDP. But that capital, that produced capital, actually depends critically on 2 other things. It depends on human capital. It depends on the ingenuity of people working individually and collectively, their knowledge, experience, institutions, their cultures. And it depends on natural capital, all the stuff we get free from nature, energy, water, minerals, etc. And so I like this diagram because it shows that that produced bit, the blue bit, is dependent on the human bit, and all that is dependent on nature. So if we're going to account for nature in this capitals framework, this is an economic framework, so it's primarily about people, we have to look at how that natural capital meets sustainably the needs of a growing society, of people, and how it supports their well-being now and in the future. So let's look at this goal that the government set to be the first generation to leave the natural environment in a better state than it's intended. So here we are. Here's biodiversity, or natural capital, a slightly broader term, and it's basically declining, as I've shown you. And here's 2015, which is where we are now. So what we have to do in order to meet that goal is to improve it from where it is now. So to go up the green line within a generation. Take a generation as 25 years. So we've got to somehow get up to that green line. Now, business as usual would carry on this red line down to the bottom here. So we've got to do a couple of things. You've got to stop that decline going so fast. Then you've got to protect what's there to bring it up to where we are in 2015. And then beyond that, you've actually got to add some more. You've got to invest in new natural capital. Otherwise, you're not going to meet this government target. And that's pretty challenging. I think probably when they set this, they didn't really mean that. They just meant to stop that decline rather than to improve it. But anyway, it says in a better state than it's inherited. So that's where we need to be. So I'm going to give you some of the recommendations from our report this year. So the Natural Capital Committee has had 3 years. We will finish this year. Our final report came out at the end of January and has our recommendations from 3 years' work. Because of the election coming up, we've delivered our report to government, but it will be the new government that responds after May. So there's a bit of a gap now while we wait for a new government to be elected to formally respond to it. But anyway, it's all available. You can read all this stuff on the Natural Capital Committee website, including a lot of our background papers. But I'll give you some of the headlines for our recommendations to government. So the first thing is, if you want to save natural capital for these benefits that people get from nature, you have to be clear about what you need. We cannot save everything. That's very clear. We live on a very crowded planet. So you have to think about what are the really high-risk areas, the areas where we don't want to venture into, where we've got so little tropical forest, or where water quality is so poor or air quality is so poor that we can't restore it. We need to think about the most beautiful places, the most intact bits of natural communities, species, ecosystems that we will not allow to go. And that's about setting some targets. And there are not really very many targets. In the work that I'm going to show you, we took targets from existing government policies. So there are some for nature conservation, for water quality, for air quality, but there's a lot more work that needs doing here, and there are various lines of evidence that can be used to decide what those targets are. There's some scientific evidence, such as the amount of pollution that tips a freshwater system into a eutrophic state from which it's difficult to recover. We can use economic evidence based on costs and benefits, or these targets can simply reflect societal demands, as I think they do at the moment with many of the nature conservation targets. So there's a work to be done on that we outline to government. But before we've done that, there isn't time to do that. There are some systems that we identified as already being at high risk. So these are bits of nature where further degradation will definitely cause problems for society that are difficult to deal with or to reverse. And this is the ones that we identified in what we called our risk register, which was a quick look through what we could pull together as natural capital accounts just from existing information. It's just a first effort. But even this, I think, revealed some useful things for policy. So the areas that came out at being at the highest risk were clean water, particularly the natural regulation of water in upland areas, uplands and moorlands and so on. Restoring those could benefit clean water downstream substantially. We found many areas where wildlife was declining, particularly semi-natural grasslands, farmlands, and freshwater areas. And this was mostly due to the quality of those habitats. It wasn't that we haven't got enough areas for wildlife, it's just that they're badly managed. So that's something that's easy to reverse. We have to improve natural carbon storage as part of our commitments to climate change targets. There's a lot we can do with natural environments to help buffer people and infrastructure from hazards, storms, floods, and even within cities, noise, high wind, and so on. There's a lot that natural capital can do there. Our examination of the evidence also revealed that these recreational benefits from nature are really big, much bigger than anyone has appreciated. And with growing populations, particularly in urban areas, there's a need for more recreational opportunities. There's more we can do with clean air. Air quality is a major problem in many cities in the UK, and we're in breach of some bits of pollution legislation, and managing the natural capital aspects of that, again, would have very quick benefits. And the bottom one is also really interesting, that we could do a lot to improve the productivity of marine fisheries if we just stop fishing them so hard for a bit. You stop fishing them, let them recover, the productive biomass will increase. So the third area we looked at was to do with natural capital accounting. You can't manage things unless you've got a record of it. You need to know what you've got. And so we need to take action to measure and value what's happening to all our assets, and formally put this into decision making. So actually, during the course of those 3 years, the Office of National Statistics has started formally recording natural capital on its books. We worked quite hard with the people in the Office of National Statistics, and they've got a partial record. So last year, they reported the value of UK natural capital as £1.6 trillion. Actually, their estimate is dominated by non-renewables, by minerals, oil and gas. There isn't very much of the kind of thing that I've talked about, the renewables, the nature aspects, but we're working with them to try and put that in. And of course, that's really important, because if you see GDP increasing continually, but natural capital declining, you know it's unsustainable. So we're keen on getting that better recorded. Much of the natural capital in this country is actually the responsibility of private or semi-private organisations, NGOs, private landowners and so on. And so however much you do at government level, it's only going to meet part of the problem. So we've done a lot of work as well, working with corporate bodies on corporate natural capital accounting. And this is really interesting, because these bodies are used to doing accounting. They're used to having to produce annual accounts of their financial capital. And to some extent, they do this for buildings and infrastructure. So we're now saying you need to also account for your natural capital. And that would allow you to track degradation over time, track benefits that your company or organization accrues from managing that natural capital well. But really crucially, when you put it into the accounts, if it's degrading, then you also have to write down the costs of recovering it. So this is like a depreciation charge in a building. If you record your natural capital and you can see it deteriorating over time, you have to put the restoration costs into the account as well. So we think there are lots of benefits to come from this corporate natural capital accounting, and we've produced a generic framework to help bodies do it. We piloted it with some private companies, Lafarge, Tarmac, and United Utilities, which is a water company, and we also piloted it with the National Trust and the Crown Estate, so an NGO and a public body. And they really engaged with this, all those companies very well. They liked it, they fed back some experience, and now we're working with a wider group to do this as well. And those guidelines for corporate natural capital accounting are being developed through this iterative process with a whole range of bodies. So that's been very interesting. Now, as I mentioned, it isn't enough just to protect what we've got. We've also got to invest in new natural capital. So we have to do this. The time scale is very short, so you have to do the investment that has the biggest return in the shortest amount of time. So what are the natural capital investments that could very quickly pay back to society? And we spent quite a bit of time looking at this. I'm going to show you one example that comes from thinking about where to plant woodlands. So actually the government has committed to planting an extra 250,000 hectares of new woodland over the next 50 years. And we can ask the question using some of these economic tools about where would be the best place to put that woodland. And this is the answer if we put that woodland where it maximizes market goods, that is, it maximizes the value of timber only. But in our analysis, we looked at all these other benefits that people get from woodland. We looked at greenhouse gas benefits, the mitigation of carbon, and we looked at recreational value of woodlands. And if you put all those in, actually they swamp the timber values. These are much more important and large-scale economic benefits. This one now, instead of being a net loss of £66 million a year to the government, becomes a gain of £546 million a year, so that's a big benefit. But you see how different the placing of those woodlands is. And that's because now we're thinking about recreation and carbon, not timber. So we're looking at where people live, we're looking at places that's particularly good for carbon sequestration, and we're not so worried about the trade-offs with agriculture because these values actually turn out to be quite high. So you see all these new woodlands around the major cities, around London, Manchester, Liverpool, and so on. So that's the kind of approach that we've used in these evaluating new investment cases. So these are the ones where we found there was a really good case for investment. So I've just shown you the woodland planting one. There's also upland peatland restoration. This would deliver net benefits of 570 million over 40 years in carbon alone. That's without any of the wildlife, recreation, aesthetic benefits. Wetland recreation, you get major benefits for nearby towns and cities. These intertidal habitats, again, the hazard regulation as well as carbon storage and nursery grounds for fish stocks. And then here's the fisheries management, which is always going to be a very important benefit. So those are ones that we recommend as high priority investments for the near future. And then there's a set where we think there's a pretty good case, but we couldn't quite get the evidence together, which has to do with urban green space, air quality, the environmental improvement of farming, and managing catchments, managing the whole catchment, the interaction between farming upstream and urban development downstream. And the interesting thing is here, we make a recommendation to government that natural capital should be treated like any other infrastructure. Government invests in road schemes, rail schemes, flood defences, And you look at the benefit-cost ratios of those investments. They go around 4 to up to 8 for flood defence. But our recommendations for these natural capital infrastructure projects are on the same sort of scale. So they have also very good returns, benefit-cost ratios from government investment. So finally, so where does the money come from for this? We're not expecting all this to come from government, and so there's a list of thoughts that we came up with about where the money might come from. So one of them would be these capital maintenance payments, as corporations and NGOs and private organisations write down in their accounts their natural capital, they could also make payments to recover it, and that would actually be a very efficient way to do it. A more radical one is that you charge rents from non-renewable resources. Other countries do this. Norway has a large wealth fund from its depletion of North Sea gas. So where you remove non-renewables, oil, gas and so on, you put the money into a wealth fund that is to maintain the renewable bits of the environment. You can get compensation payments from developers. You can use taxes and charges more imaginatively. You get a long way by reforming and eliminating perverse subsidies. And then there are lots of new approaches, plastic bags, payments for ecosystem services, and so on. So we don't think the financing problem is insoluble. It's difficult, but it's not insoluble. So I'm going to finish with this quote from Theodore Roosevelt, who said all this 100 years ago, amazingly. So he said, "The nation behaves well if it treats natural resources as assets, which it must turn over to the next generation, increased and not impaired in value. Conservation means development as much as it does protection." I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Georgina. We do have time for some questions. If you do have a question, if you could just wait for a microphone to reach you. There's one down the front so people online can hear. Thanks.
One thing that occurs to me that's very important is the expansion of knowledge by teaching people. And it seems extraordinary, and I hope that you put it to your committee, or did put it to your committee, about libraries and having exhibitions and so on and so forth, because the closure of libraries means the closure of people getting knowledge, not like at University College where we have a labyrinth of knowledge, but and I quite like what Prince Charles said the day before yesterday about treating the planet as a sick patient. But could there not be a more expansive committee? I mean, you know, it's good what you've done, but it seems to be almost like a little sideline river and a stream. I don't hear anyone raving about this in the House of Commons or the House of Lords, and it's quite interesting that they're going to have their response after the election, where the finger can't be pointed and people can't ask for more to be done.
Yeah, no, so it's a really good point. So actually, it has had some exposure in government, because our previous 2 reports have also gone to government and there have been formal responses. And actually the Environmental Affairs Committee, the Select Committee, has been pursuing, you know, what actions are taken in response. So I agree it's not been major, but it has been taken seriously in government. On the education issue, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think the general need for people to understand more about the environment and their dependence on it is really crucial. And libraries, museums, all these kinds of institutions.
That's my point. Have you said anything about that they shouldn't shut libraries? I mean, even good old Anna Bennett did a speech recently about the environment.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree with you.
Thanks. There's a question just behind you there in the end.
Hey, I was just wondering how much this is going to be taken seriously by economists, because it seems at the stage it's at now, it's all very nice, and it's all, you know, everyone's very happy because it's all very nice. But as soon as you start saying to businesses, there's going to be a number on your accounts, we're going to charge you a tax, then they're going to start arguing with your measuring methods. That's what normally happens, right? Yeah. Do you see a way around that, or is that just a problem for the future?
So I think there are a couple of ways around it. One is, if it turns out that the business actually is dependent on those natural capital assets, then they will benefit from taking care of it in an ongoing basis, rather than having to sort of suddenly panic at the end of 10 years and go and find another site to dig in or another place to get water and so on. So I think in many cases, it's in the self-interest of the companies to do this well. And it's just been a failure of the past that we haven't done it. That, of course, is not always the case. There will be some for whom it looks like an extra burden. But if it turns out that these are assets that we really do need for the public purse, then for the public benefit, then actually, ultimately, taxes and subsidies should switch around to incentivize this better behavior by companies. So the idea that this is an extra cost or an obstacle to business profitability is definitely a perception. But I think in the long run, it could diminish, and it could actually be the companies that manage their natural capital better that win out. But I mean, the economists that we've worked with here, you know, do a lot of corporate accounting, and so they've been very sensitive to that issue. And these companies we've worked with have been very welcoming of it, actually.
Thanks. There's a question just here, and then one here. Thanks.
Thanks for a fascinating talk. Do you have capital value comparisons for a new runway at Heathrow and Gatwick?
No. So we get asked about that quite a lot, and HS2, actually. But I think that would be a sort of thing that would be very interesting to do with this full accounting framework. The difficulty is putting them on a fair basis, because those things like the runway at Heathrow or HS2, exactly what you put into that financial account, you know, how far in the future, which benefits and costs to whom, where and when, affects how that will come out. And so you could do it, but you'd end up having very long arguments about exactly how to do the accounting.
Okay, there's a question here and then in the middle.
Wonderful. Thank you for a lovely speech. And I was wondering if you're having any international collaboration with other research teams, because as far as I understand it, a lot of the legislatory power is with the European Union.
Yeah, so there's an international framework for doing this that's come through the UN. So there's an experimental system of environmental accounting that they are piloting right now, which is not dissimilar to what we've done here, but it isn't nearly as comprehensive as we've done. But the UN is definitely interested in doing this. There are a series of ecosystem accounts that are being done internationally. So there's one of those in Europe right now underway. It's different to what I've talked about here in that it's much more about the flows of ecosystem services. I've talked about stocks mostly, of natural capital as an investment in some stock that continues to provide flows. Many of these European ones are looking at the benefits on a sort of annual basis rather than looking at the capital investment. There's also a World Bank initiative called WAVES, which is the wealth accounting valuation of the environment, something like that, anyway, which is doing a similar thing. But again, it's still experimenting with exactly how to do it.
We have time for one last question, if we can. Keep it quick, though. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to quickly ask about another contentious issue. Have you considered the impact of fracking?
Yeah, well, so I can't comment specifically on fracking, but fracking is a great example of where I think if we were going to do it, and it may be that we end up doing it, you could put the benefits from fracking into a wealth fund and use that money to support a lot of other infrastructure development, rather than letting the profits from fracking, which have many environmental consequences, flow to the company that's producing it. The government could set up a wealth fund and have the investment in that. I'm saying that as a individual personally, and not saying that as a member of the Natural Capital Committee.
Okay, well, I'm afraid that is all we've got time for. So I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for your questions. Mostly thank you very much to Professor Georgina Mace.